Our next speaker, I think, probably has the hardest slot of the day, and that's because the after lunch slot is always the hardest. But luckily for us, Lee Matheson is going to be coming on stage, and I'm sure if anyone can work us through the challenges of emissions, it will be Lee, and he has aptly titled his presentation Emissions Impossible, focusing on some of the future farm systems research that Lee and some of his colleagues at Ag First were involved with. So welcome to the stage, Lee. So Lee has had a career starting out in the financial market space and has been working in agribusiness advisory for almost 20 years, specialising in agribusiness, corporate farm management systems and the economic impact of environmental policy. Lee is based out of Rotorua and is currently the Managing Director of Pear and Ag, where they have a team of 26 people working with farmers and growers right throughout the country. Having known Lee for a while, he usually, when I'm talking to him, is rushing off to do something outdoors, hunting usually, or some other activity with his kids, which is fantastic that he's able to manage both of those things. But look, Lee, looking forward to hearing from you today and how you can help us all to navigate what might sometimes feel like a slightly impossible task. So over to you.
Cool, thanks, Kate. Hey, thanks for having me, everybody. I'm a bit like Kate in that Southland's kind of my spiritual home as well. My grandmother was born in Lumsden, and then her dad was born in Invercargill. Having been duck shooting with me over the weekend, my 16-year-old son thinks that Southland is his spiritual home now too. So it's going to be an expensive May from here on in for the rest of my life, I suspect. So this work is titled aptly Emission Impossible. I've been involved in working with farmers and industry and scientists to try and unpick the practicality and reality of lowering emissions from our primary sector now for about 3 or 4 years, and was sort of one of the co-leads along with my colleague Erica van Reenen at that other agricultural consultancy company, who are leading some work funded by the Ag Emissions Centre, so formerly known as the New Zealand Greenhouse Gas Research Centre. And that work was very much based on the context of what if there is no silver bullet? So we already know, hopefully in the room, the quandary we have around emissions. We know that emissions are tightly linked to New Zealand's farm systems, that methane, our largest agricultural emission, is almost completely linked to feed intake. Nitrous oxide is closely linked to the nitrogen cycle, which is a really strong driver of our economic systems. We should hopefully know that most mitigations require or involve management change. So there's very little that you can do in a farm business to deal with emissions. It doesn't require you doing something different to what you were doing the previous day. And the uncomfortable truth with most of this is that meaningful reductions in emissions usually come with lower production and with higher costs and therefore lower returns. And fundamentally, we have trapped in this wicked problem that to get meaningful reductions at scale from our primary sector, there is no free lunch. And while I don't have a slide on this next comment, the reality is that the direction of travel is inexorably linked to us needing to lower emissions. Whether that's because we have a domestic emissions target that we've set to our wider community that we have to achieve, whether we have some global commitments around lowering emissions, whether it's the signals we are now getting from the customers who buy our products that we need to lower emissions intensity to help them lower their gross emissions, whether it's actually a personal view you have around needing to make a difference around climate change that's driven by human activity. The reality is, irrespective of the reason for doing it, there is an increasing reason to have to do something. So there's probably a good question to understand is why do we need more? If we know all that stuff, why do we need to do more farm systems research into lowering emissions? Well, fundamentally, this piece of work that I'm going to talk to you about was driven by this idea that we needed to explore more disruptive impacts and more transformational solutions in the space to lower emissions. Most of the work that had been done in New Zealand around lowering emissions was very much just based on what we call incremental change. So business as usual, or maybe business as we need it to be. So thinking about how do we make small gains within our farm systems that really don't require us to change very much. You know, we hear a lot about, and there's been a lot of research money and a lot of private capital going into solutions to reduce emissions. You know, the vaccine program is massive. We are seeing now, you know, boluses with methanogen inhibitors, you know, very close to being commercially released. We have seen a lot of work go into genetic changes in our sheep and our cattle. But there is a risk with all of those things that they do not deliver the silver bullet that we think will allow us, that we'll have to allow us to keep farming essentially the same as we do, and just simply say, but hey, great, we lower emissions, nothing else to see here. So this research program was very much focused on what if we actually have to do more than we think we do? What if the technology that we're saying is going to save us, our market doesn't want? What then? What the fuck do we do then? So this is really about understanding what that might look like. So we looked at two sort of key parts of I guess, the whole farm system. So we did work looking at what existing farmers were doing on their farms and had managed to achieve in the way of emissions reduction. Probably not with the incentive to reduce emissions, but what had they done anyway? We worked with a number of farmer groups across the Motu. You're going to hear from two of them later on, straight after me, to understand what farmers could do collectively to try and solve this wicked problem. We also looked at work on what if there was a world where we had to have less cows? What else could we do to deliver on the emissions reductions that we're being told we have to achieve? And then finally, and we did some really good case study work with Southlanders, and it's great to see some of you in the room here today, thank you for coming along, around what will happen to our communities as we have to move to a lower emissions primary sector. And of course, you know, that's quite broad. We don't really know how low do we have to go. When we started this research, we were staring down the barrel of as much as a 49% reduction in methane emissions required. That was dialed back about the day before I released our white paper. You know, so, you know, it is a changing and it is a moving feast. But putting that aside, the direction of travel is pretty clear, at least in my mind. So, it's great doing research, and it's great that taxpayers fund the science system, and we could talk about that for a very long time because it's highly relevant at the moment. But fundamentally, research is only of any value if we can get it out to people like yourselves and actually tell you what we learnt and make it relevant for you. So this is Lord Kitchener, the face of Britain's World War I mobilisation effort. You know, your country needs you. Well, your country needs you guys as well. So we've got to make sure that what we've learned is relevant. So I've got the 6 slides talking about, I guess, what I would call the sort of key take-home messages from about 3 years worth of research that Erica's and my teams did. Some of this will probably be pretty obvious to many of you. Maybe you'll learn a couple of new things. So number 1, so incremental change alone is insufficient to change the dial on emissions. So if we want or we need to deliver significant reduction in the agricultural emissions, so we're talking here about methane and nitrous oxide, we're not talking about electrifying your farm or moving to biodiesel. Those things are great, please do all those things, but if we actually have to reduce the amount of methane and nitrous oxide that spills out of our farm systems that we're told we don't really need, then we can't do that very well if we just make incremental change. You know, we do have some current mitigations, but the toolbox is pretty slim. We know we can reduce stocking rate. Hands up who wants to reduce stocking rate. No, don't do that. You know, the reality is, you know, how low do you want to go? We can do that, but at some point our farm systems will not sustain a reduction in stocking rate beyond a certain point. We can absolutely remove and reduce nitrogen fertiliser, which is great, until you hit about the 16th of August, and you go, damn. You know, so that's not that great either. We know genetics have the potential to do this. We know that low methane genetics are highly heritable. But for those of you who went to the Ag Emissions Conference last week or are on social media or read the Farmers Weekly, you will see that unfortunately the expression of those low methane genetics has not been passed through or available in lactating daughters. So if you're doing dairy beef, that's fantastic. If you're milking cows, maybe less so. And fundamentally, we all know that if we have less ruminants in total and we change land use, then we get some really big reductions. But most people here didn't come to farm pine trees. So ultimately, we know that these individual mitigations are in practice only going to deliver sort of less than 10% reduction. And most of the technology that we think is going to save us in this extent is still not yet commercially available. It may not be for some time. And if it is, our markets may not find it acceptable. But there is some good news in all this. Take home number 2, that good farming delivers emissions reduction, or at least to a point. Okay? So the work that Erica did, looking at a number of farming businesses across New Zealand, across system, across location, across system type, most of these farm businesses had achieved a reduction of somewhere between 3 and 15% gross emissions reduction over a sort of 3 to 5 year period. And that was largely driven by what I would consider to be good farming. They made efficiency gains in their production systems. They made better management decisions. Some of them actually chose to use their land in a better, more suitable way than they had been doing beforehand. And we got some reasonable results. And all of those farmers are still in business, and you can take my word for it, they were all highly profitable both beforehand and afterwards. But when we looked at why farmers had been doing that, emissions reduction wasn't the priority, it wasn't the primary driver, but it was one of the big co-benefits to them wanting to farm differently and farm better and make better decisions about their assets. Their focus was on how do they become more profitable, how do they become more resilient, or maybe have their business demonstrate a bit more fortitude, as Jacqueline was saying beforehand. How do they improve performance? And of course, emissions reduction is not linear. So some people did a similar thing and got a different result because they're running a biological system. And of course, we all farm for different reasons. We're there trying to achieve our own individual outcomes. And some people have got a greater profit focus. Some people have got a focus that's more on, more on production. We farm for different reasons, which is always going to have an impact on the outcomes that we get. With the work that Erica was doing, looking at how farmers work collectively together, we had the opportunity, along with a social researcher from BSI, to look at how farmers might collectively problem solve. Now, as part of that process, we also got some really good insight into the behaviour of farmers, that's just people just like you, as to why they had or hadn't made much of a change or made changes in their business in relation to the emissions question. And I guess what we sort of would like you to take home, which I think is really positive for you as farmers, and I think really important for policy makers to understand, is that by and large, farmers weren't resisting change. It wasn't that you didn't want to do this stuff. You were just waiting for clarity on what you needed to do, by when and how much. And when we dug down to this a little bit more, there were these kind of key things that came out. So there is a lot, or there was, and I think there still is, a lot of confusing messaging and misinformation. And spoiler alert here is I usually offend someone when I speak, so if that's you, tough, okay? But ultimately no one is innocent. So my personal view is that I don't think that you, as farmers in this room, have been particularly well served by many of the bodies that say they represent you when it comes to getting you to line up and focus on where you need to go and all do it the same way at the same time. There's lots of noise around this space. There's lots of people who are trying to use this issue to position how and why they do things. There's an awful lot of politics in this space, and that's good to a point, but at some point it becomes a bit of a fucking problem, excuse my language. So, there's a whole lot of policy uncertainty. The ETS is problematic. Potentially a really great piece of legislation, but completely open to political management or mismanagement around settings. So, carbon farming sounds great when it's $80 a tonne. It's less great when it was $80 a tonne when you planted the trees and paid 17 grand a hectare for the land, and now the price is 30. It's a really hard environment in which to actually make decisions in. We hear a lot about this being the ticket to the game, and I totally agree with that. But sometimes people are being told that actually that's the icing on the cake. And those premiums actually often aren't that meaningful and actually probably aren't even that real. So, there's an awful lot of financial risk that business owners like you take when they make system change, particularly so when that system change might be around actually lowering stocking rate and potentially pivoting to new industries and new land uses. Farming better is really hard. Yet we know that capability and people constraints are a big issue for the sector. They're an issue right now. They're just as great an issue if we're trying to get meaningful change by actually upping how we farm and making different decisions. And ultimately, I do think, personally, that there has been a degree of disconnection or inconsistency in market signals and market language. Whether we're talking about gross emissions or emissions intensity, it's really hard to understand. Nestle tell us they want a reduction in emissions intensity, yet at the same time they actually have a gross emissions target from their business of 30%. Danone is the same. What should we be focusing on? How do we do that? And actually, if we're going to get paid, if there's going to be additional money for low intensity product, who should actually get the funding for that? Should we fund those who already, or reward those who already have low emissions based on where they farm geographically? Or should we be putting that money to support people to actually make meaningful change when they can? Take home number 4. So doing stuff together is way better than doing it alone. The work that we did with the collective groups, we're working with farmers to allow them to see if they could explore solutions to get meaningful emissions reduction and letting them explore what that looked like. We found that when farmers worked together, we got really high engagement when there was a clear understanding around what they were there together to do. So a well-defined problem statement that wasn't too detailed, and that the groups were well facilitated. So the key with these groups is that these were farmer-led groups. So it wasn't some pointy head like me standing up and telling people, this is what we're going to do, team, this is how we're going to do it, now get on and do it. It was someone like me standing up and saying, so, emissions reduction. What do you guys want to do about that? Now, that's not how a standard discussion group typically operates, right? But actually that's the way to get farmers engaged and to take ownership of what they were there to try and do. And we obviously had some benefits from this. There was some shared learning, and hopefully Emma and Stephen are not going to put me wrong here, but there was some shared learning. There was some increased confidence to act because you knew you weren't doing it alone. And I guess to some extent there is some collective accountability. When you make a commitment to your mate about what you're going to do, they might be able to hold you to account better than a regional authority or a government agency might. So, so farmers working together is really powerful. It is also not simple, and it does require resources. Take home number 5. So when we looked at what we might do if we couldn't have the same number of cows and sheep that we had today, we investigated a lot of alternate land uses. And the reality is that for most of them, the constraint is actually as much as or more outside the farm gate than is actually what we can do behind it. The land uses that we looked at are all being used in New Zealand, but they're not scaled anywhere near like they are for sheep, meat, beef, and dairy. Reality is that without breakthrough technology, based on the commitments that we have made internationally and domestically to our fellow community members, to our processors and customers, without that, lower emissions equals lower ruminants. And we can certainly do that, but it's a scary, scary place. The reality is that we do what we do because they actually make the most money. They actually fit the land uses that the land that we have more than anything else does. We have a whole lot of infrastructure that supports industries that we do. And when we scale those across New Zealand, and New Zealand is actually very good at breathing in and breathing out of land use, but ultimately we've already got those systems and their IP and their institutional knowledge in place. When you're starting with something else that no one else has been brave enough to do, you've got to start from zero. These land uses that we could use often have higher volatility to climate, they have higher risk. They usually come with a lot of extra capital required, and often that capital is not going to be well deployed. You can spend an awful lot of money on a chestnut peeling machine that you are only going to use for 6 weeks of the year, because the chestnuts only have a 6-week period where they fruit and you can actually manage the fruit viably. And then when you do pick those chestnuts and you peel them, what do you do with them after that? Because the chestnut tank is not going to come twice a day to pick them up, or at least not yet. And if they do, who's going to fund that? And ultimately, as we already know, we have a small domestic market for meat and dairy. It's even smaller for chestnuts. The reality is that we are going to have to anything that we do at scale, we're going to have to export. And actually, that's a problem because domestic markets are really good for learning how to do stuff. We can trial stuff. New Zealand is effectively the experiment for the globe for this sort of stuff, right? FPOS machines are in New Zealand first. So having domestic markets great for testing development of new innovation, new processing techniques, new products. But if you've only got a small market, and you're in a small part of a small market that's interested in eating chestnuts, that's really hard to do. So, ultimately, if there was an obvious, better alternative to what we do in our primary sector, we'd probably already be doing it. Take home number 6. Solutions for lowering emissions from our primary sector are going to need to be region-specific. The reality is that we won't be able to have central government say, this is the plan, and everyone has to follow the plan. Our regions are all different. We looked at this in depth, looking at contrasting Northland and you lot down here in Southland, And the reality is that your economies, your landscapes, your communities are all very different. They have different drivers already. They have different trajectories as we already sit here looking forward. And we're going to have different solutions. We won't have one solution at scale. And that's scary if you're a central politician, I suspect. It means we're going to have to let people take responsibility for doing stuff themselves. And ultimately, we're going to have to operate the stuff in different trajectories, as I've already said. When we talk to your fellow farmers and stakeholders in Southland, and we asked you what you thought your region would look like in 15, 20 years' time, you already told us it was going to look quite different to what it looks now. And that was in the absence of an emissions reduction target. We heard that there are going to be less cows, there's going to be more arable, there's going to be some more trees, spoiler alert, and we're going to have an economy that might be even more embedded in the energy sector. That's quite a different economy and different skill sets required to the one we have today. Now, if we layer lowering emissions on top of that, that's going to amplify or slow down some of those things. So what? So you've just heard me blather on for the last 20 minutes. So what? Some cool research. I had a good time. I got paid to do it. It was great. Met some new people. It's fantastic. But what does it actually really mean for you today? What should you take home from this, from my perspective? So when I wrote this and I was writing down your mission, should you choose to accept it, I was about to say your mission, Jim. Yeah, see, some people know who that was. And then I went, shit, no one else is going to know that. So then I thought, oh, well, I'll just leave Ethan out and we'll just run them. So how you identify with Mission Impossible, you can listen to this. But your mission, I guess, as farmers, should you choose to accept it, and I think you're going to have to accept it, is that you need to focus to achieve an emissions reduction that's meaningful. I'm not saying that's the magical 24%. I'm not saying that's halving your emissions intensity, but you've got to do something. So to achieve an emissions reduction from your business that is meaningful, you're going to need to concentrate on building capability and confidence, and you need to do that with your mates as well as just with yourselves. Okay? We're going to have to farm better. Farming better is hard. Learn from your mates. That's really important. You're going to have to stack. So stacks is the very trendy word we use in science and economics when we're talking about adding things onto one another. You are not going to be able to use a single mitigation to achieve the outcome that you want, whatever that is. You're going to have to layer these things onto one another. And layering in a biological system is really fun because you layer one thing and it changes, and you layer another thing that changes again. So there's going to be a lot of change as we do this. But you're going to have to think about how you address productivity. And we've heard that you guys are already highly productive. Great. You're going to have to get better. You're going to have to focus on productivity. You're going to have to think about sensible land use change in some way, shape, or form. That may not be driven by emissions per se. That might be driven by other things like water quality or just raw economics. You're going to have to lean into technology as is appropriate to your system as and when that arrives. And I guess ultimately, don't do nothing. Don't go home and think that was a load of rubbish. you're going to have to change something in your business if you want to stay viable. Because change is coming to a farm near all of us. For people in the room who are representing industry and policy, this is where I'd start. We need clear, consistent messaging from all of you about emissions reduction in our primary sector. And we need you guys to help the rest of us de-risk the investment we're going to have to make in our businesses. We want stable signals. We don't want flip-flop as governments change. We don't want flip-flop as things become trendy or non-trendy. We want stable signals, and they have to be aligned with the market. We can't be going over here if Nestle says we want to be going over here, okay? And I guess ultimately, we need to support and resource farmer-led change. We need to rethink how we do extension in New Zealand. We need to rethink how we give farmers the opportunity for you to take ownership of the change you have to make, and then allow people like me to help support you do that. And that costs money, so we need more of it. So this message is going to self-destruct in 5 seconds because Kate's walking up onto the stage. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Lee, for that. I have to say I've got some learnings I'm going to take for you around how to keep an audience awake after lunch, because in my previous gig when I used to talk about things like RMA, the reform and all those types of things, everyone just wanted to go to sleep. So taking some notes there from you, thank you very much. Everyone else will also be interested to know that every time I talk to Lee now that I work in industry good, he likes to give me a hard time about the terrible job we're doing, so I'm trying to take on board those messages too. But look, Lee, a question that has come through on the app, and it links to a question that I had, is you talked about good farming practices help to drive some reduction, and I guess I think about that, and I think about is that just us achieving the low-hanging fruit?
No, not necessarily. So, there's been pretty good work done to try and estimate what productivity change actually means to the New Zealand farming sector. So this came out of, I think, the RMPP work actually, so I might be a bit wrong here, but ultimately when they considered what would it mean if you could shift the bell curve of performance, because there's a bell curve around performance, if you could shift the bell curve from the mean to the upper quartile and achieve that across the sector at the time, this would have been about 10, 12 years ago, that would have added $3 billion to both the dairy and sheep and beef sectors respectively from making that change. So at the time, there was a $6 billion uplift in farm gate profit from doing that. And I don't think that's not really low-hanging fruit. Like good farm practice is not the same as good farming. So what we're really talking about is people actually getting the productivity gains within their system that we need. So, I usually offend somebody, so I'm terribly sorry if this is you. But if you're lambing at 110%, don't necessarily call me, call someone. We have to do a better job than that. I mean, that's a massive impact that it has on our business if we are doing that. If we're not using our resources appropriately, difference between a good farmer and a bad farmer is 3 days. If you're moving those stock, a day late every time you shift those animals, you've got a great opportunity. And I think that's what we're talking about there. And that's not low hanging. That requires people to really want to do that. It requires a capability uplift, and that's hard. So I think that's what I'm really talking about.
That's great, thank you. And look, now, if everyone could thank Lee with another round of applause, that would be great.
Great, thank you.